Welcome back. This is part 6 and the last segment of our New Mexico road trip through the Rio Grande Rift. We're going to pick up where we left off at the Jemez Historic Site. We'll wind our way to a super volcano before visiting Bandelier National Monument. Then we'll head north to see where New Mexico is splitting apart. Before our last stop in a field of volcanoes, we'll even climb one. We'll go through Santa Fe and Tahoe's along the way. Our first stop is 30 minutes up a winding road to a super volcano. Well, its crater, which is called a caldera. It's smaller than the Yellowstone supervolcano, but still the Valles Caldera is over 13 miles across. It's so big that when you're next to it, it looks nothing like a volcano. And guess what? We're driving on it. It covers 89,000 acres, and that clearing is just a small part of it. Those mountains aren't the edge either. They're younger volcanic domes near the center of the caldera, and one is over 11,000 feet tall. You need a little help from Google to see just how big this place is. And by the way, it's one of our youngest national preserves. This is the view from the Valles Grande pullout on Highway 4. It's one of several meadows, and its elevation is about 8,000 feet. And this is really what you're going to see at this park. It's mostly undeveloped, with a few hiking and biking trails, and lots of wildlife viewing. There's even bears. The valleys, or meadows, are remarkably peaceful. But 1.6 million years ago, that wasn't the case. That's when a bunch of smaller volcanoes combined to form one super one, resulting in an eruption that spewed 75 square miles of ash and molten rock. If you're old enough to remember the Mount St. Helens eruption, it spewed out less than a half a cubic mile of material. So this thing really was super. In places, several hundred feet of ash cooled to become the perfect material to make cliff dwellings. Volcanoes can form obsidian, and starting about 11,000 years ago, man found it here, and started using it to make arrow points and knives. The Park Service even made a trail to one of the obsidian pit mines. I had to save the hike for next time, because I was due at the cliff dwellings at Bandelier. It's about a 45-minute drive, but I decided to go through Santa Fe, which added an hour to the trip. I hadn't seen Santa Fe in a while, and boy has it grown. Even in the off-season, it was crowded and expensive. In the historic part of town, it seems every building is a gallery of some sort, which of course is one of the main attractions. After a quick lunch stop, I continued on my way to Bandelier National Monument. It's a pleasant drive to the main gate. In the off-season, the park road is open from dusk to dawn. In December, the gate wasn't even manned. During the busy season, which varies, personal cars are only allowed in the early morning and late afternoon to reduce traffic and overcrowding. You got to check with the park's website for details because the dates in which they do this varies. In the busy season during the rest of the day, you have to take a shuttle bus into the park. And it leaves from a visitor center near the town of White Rock, which is several miles away. The park road starts on Pajarito Plateau, and not far from the gate there's a nice view of Frijole Canyon, which is where the cliff dwellings are. There's a short walk to the viewpoint, where there's even a couple of spotting scopes. And one is designed for those in wheelchairs. One of the info signs describes the volcanic landscape. The other one talks about how forest fires create diverse habitat, which is a good thing. The visitor center and cliff dwellings are on the valley floor, at the far end of the canyon. The 3-mile drive to the gate to the visitor center is a pretty one. And by the way, pets are allowed only in the visitor center parking lot and not on any of the trails. The elevation at the visitor center is almost 6,100 feet. And if you're a flatlander, you may feel the altitude. And the effects of altitude are even greater in the summer. On a 90-degree day, the air density is equivalent to being at about 9,000 feet. And of course, the air is also very dry. So if the altitude doesn't get you, be sure to drink enough water to avoid dehydration. There was plenty of parking when I arrived. In the 1930s and 40s, there was lodging here, but not anymore. Now there's just a store and a cafe where they serve snacks. During the busy times, this is where the shuttle will drop you off. And there are rangers here to answer questions and to hand out the helpful brochures and maps, which I highly recommend you pick up. There are over 70 miles of trails here. I'm just going to do the 1.4-mile Pueblo Loop Trail, to the cliff dwellings. It begins behind this building. The trail is not an ADA-approved path, but it is paved. And if you don't feel like walking, there's another free spotting scope. Again, one is at wheelchair height. There's archaeological sites all over the place, and you're walking past them. But most of them have been left alone and are out of sight. The highest concentration is about a half-mile down this trail. In addition to the park map, I picked up one of the trail guidebooks for a couple of bucks. It has info on the 21 markers along the way. The trail starts pretty straight and flat in this little valley. It's going to take a few minutes to get to the cliffs and take the time to wonder what it might have been like to live back then. You're walking where they walked, in what was then quite a big settlement 700 years ago. I'm not going to talk about all the markers, but the first one is for a side trail. It crosses Frejole Creek, which was the original year-round water source. On the other side of that bridge, there are trails to a waterfall and to the backcountry. This is the first ruin. If you've seen the previous segments of this road trip, you know that it's a kiva, which was used for ceremonies. It had a roof back in the day and may have looked something like this fully restored one in Aztec, New Mexico, that I shot a few years ago. Kivas were used for religious rites, and it's where important decisions were made. This one was excavated in the 1930s and only partially reconstructed. By 1200 AD, the ancestral Pueblo were growing crops in this valley, and wherever else they could. For example, they made a staircase to the top of the valley, where they also grew crops. They planted corn, beans, and squash with the help of terraces and other irrigation methods to capture and retain water. They grew plenty of food for the hundreds of people who lived here. They also hunted the game in the area, and they raised turkeys. They wove the feathers to make blankets and other household items. And of course, they ate them too. The turkeys, not the feathers. This is a small section of the ancestral Pueblo village called Kawani. It is one of several villages in the park, but of course only a small fraction of them have been excavated and reconstructed. Some of the buildings had 2 and even 3 stories. In all, there were about 400 rooms that housed just 100 people. The guidebook includes an illustration of what it might have looked like back in the day. Most of the ground floors were used for grain storage, because they were smart enough to know that they needed reserves as insurance in case a harvest failed. The turkeys were also housed on the first floor. The rooms were all connected in a protective circle, which probably means there was a threat of some sort. There was a plaza in the center with several kivas. There was an opening at only one end. And this part of the trail, well, once again, we're walking where they would have walked. This would have been on the outer edge of the plaza. The design and construction indicate that the builders likely had contact with other settlements, including Chaco Canyon and Mesa Verde. Even back then, they had extensive trade networks. Obsidian from the caldera has been found as far away as the northern plains. And feathers and the remains of macaws have been found here, and they had to come all the way from Mexico. And of course, they didn't have horses back then. They had to walk these great distances. At the Coronado site, we saw how they used adobe and mud bricks to build structures. Here, they used rock. They cut blocks from the soft volcanic tuff. And here the reconstructors used maybe a little too much mortar, but you get the basic idea of how it looked back in the day. The reconstructions were done by the Civilian Conservation Corps during the Depression in the 1930s. That was a government jobs program. And unlike today when the government gives you money when you're not working, back then the greatest generation had to do things like build walls to get money from the government. I suppose that's rather appalling if you're 20-something. At trail marker 9, there's a fork. The trail to the left bypasses some of the cliff dwellings, for those who want to avoid climbing up a few steps. Or for those who just want to take a shortcut to Longhouse Ruin and eventually Alcove House. Longhouse is several stories tall. These holes were used to anchor timber beams that acted as a floor or ceiling for the higher stories. There's also a pictograph nearby, which is a painted picture on rock, and a few petroglyphs, which are harder to see. Petroglyphs are carved into the rock, but they're not painted. The rock here lacks the desert varnish that we saw at Three Rivers and the other sites on the trip. So here, they're harder to see. If you want to go to Alcove House, that's going to add another mile to the hike. And with the help of ladders, the trail rises over 140 feet, and you'll get a nice photo up there. But it's a tricky and potentially dangerous climb. In March of 2022, a woman was climbing a ladder and was hit by a falling rock. She fell 25 feet and died due to her injuries. The trail was closed for several weeks to try to figure out what happened. Okay, back to the fork. The right path goes up a bit and heads to the cliff face. And it's too bad there were high, thin clouds. They really muted the colors of the rock, trees, and sky. It's much more vibrant on a clear, sunny day. When you're near the cliff face, you can see how easy the rock erodes. Remember, it's compressed volcanic ash that came out of that caldera we saw earlier. It's called tough, which is odd because it's actually very soft, and rain and wind erode it away. The darker areas are more eroded than the lighter ones, and the really dark areas? They're holes or pockets, the beginning of caves. About 800 years ago, someone had the idea to use stone tools to enlarge those pockets into places big enough to live in. And eventually, there were hundreds of rooms here. At the switchback, I took a good look at the tuff. You can see individual grains of ash, as well as clumps of it. They say the ash was still hot when it fell here, and that heat, along with the pressure from several hundred feet of the stuff, converted it into a loosely connected rock. The stairs take us up another 40 feet or so, and once you get around the corner, there's a nice view of the village, which is about 70 feet below us now. The trail continues around what looks like an addition to make the cave bigger. Again, they used timbers for the roof and the floor beams, and those timbers help date the age of the dwellings. Without them, it would have been very difficult to see exactly when they were built. And the dwellings seem to be everywhere, but to protect them, you're only allowed to enter the ones that have ladders, like this one. Climbing the ladder with a mirrorless camera on a big old gimbal wasn't too hard, but I wanted to get up here and show you the smoke stains on the ceiling. That must mean they had quite a few fires in here, probably for cooking and maybe also for heat. It does get cold here in the winter. To me, this spot is the highlight of Bandelier, perhaps because of the impression it made on me the first time I was here in 2000. Before that, pueblos and cliff dwellings were only things that I was forced to read about in school. Back then, the book said that the Anasazi lived here, and that is no longer a politically correct term because it means ancient enemy in Navajo. So today, they're known as the ancestral pueblo. But anyway, let's get back to my story. This place was the seed that compelled me to visit more places like this, all over the Southwest, and even the large mound builder sites at Cahokia in Illinois. It all started on this short paved trail in Bandelier National Monument. The trail continues to Longhouse and the Pictograph before heading to Alcove House. So for me, this was the turnaround point. It was time to head on back down the road. It takes about 90 minutes to drive to the Rio Grande Gorge Bridge. I had to hustle to get there before sunset. A good bit of the drive is through the mountains, and it's pretty high. I think I got to about 9,000 feet at one pass. Eventually, it gets very flat at about 6,400 feet. I pulled into the parking lot just about 15 minutes before sunset. The locals were already packing up their tables full of souvenirs, so I wouldn't be doing any shopping. I got the drone up as soon as I could to catch the light. The bridge is almost 900 feet above the river. It's from here that New Mexico is spreading apart. GPS data shows that the sides of the gorge are still moving apart every year. Only by a few millimeters, but it is measurable. This tectonic activity has been going on for a long time, and it's at least partially responsible for everything we've seen on this 800-mile-ish road trip. From the beautiful white sands of the Tularosa Basin to the Guadalupe Mountains, the Big Cave, the lava flows, petroglyphs, and even the cave dwellings. This huge crack in the earth is a reminder of the power of nature and our ability to adapt to it. Like most stops on this trip, I wish I had more time to spend here. The trails along the cliff edge look particularly inviting, but now we're heading to our last stop of the road trip. The plan is to be on top of a volcano at dawn. We'll cross one last range pushed up by the rift and drive through the ski resort town of Taos for a total of 2.5 hours through the mountains to our next hotel. Morning came very early. And there was no need for a wake-up call because the guy next door was warming up his diesel pickup truck at 5:30 in the morning. I planned on an early start anyway, so I was off to Capulin Volcano National Monument because the website said it was open at sunrise. But websites can be wrong. When I got here, I found the gate for the road to the top doesn't open until 8. So I had plenty of time to shoot the surrounding landscape, which is quite pretty and reminds me a little bit of Montana, except for these basalt cliffs. I drove far enough away from the park's property that I was able to legally fly the drone. Capulin is a typical 1,000-foot-high cinder cone volcano. It's in the easternmost volcanic field in North America, and it formed about 60,000 years ago. And what's really cool is there's a road to the top. After a brief stop at the visitor center, I headed up the paved road, which just about circles around the cone, to a parking lot near the very top. The views of the surrounding landscape, they're pretty, and they show that we're definitely in a volcanic field. There are several volcanoes, cones, and vents all over the place, especially if you look to the southwest. There's a trail to the top, and from there you can see a very large shield volcano, Sierra Grande. It was the source of much of the basalt flows like these. Early cattle drivers used some of them as natural corrals in the mid-1800s. And the history of the place doesn't stop there. The old Santa Fe Trail came through here. The volcanoes were excellent guideposts. And if you don't like heights, there's also a short trail to the bottom of the crater. But for me, the early morning view from the top is the best. It's a great place to wrap up our tour of the parks of New Mexico's Rio Grande Rift. If you're a fan of national parks, you know that many of our western parks are overcrowded and even difficult to get into. But that's not the case here, making now the perfect time to visit New Mexico before its parks are discovered and become overcrowded too. For now, these national parks are some of the least visited in the country. And on this road trip, we've seen how beautiful they all are in very different ways. We've seen how natives live sustainably in this harsh environment, using what nature provided to create homes and to leave their mark. And we've had a glimpse of how Europeans began to change that. We've seen how the Earth itself is changing, opening fissures and filling them with lava flows, and in some places, a supervolcano and its smaller cousins. We've seen them all on the uncrowded roads of New Mexico, along a giant crack in the earth you probably didn't even know was there. But it helped create everything that we've seen as we toured the parks of New Mexico's Rio Grande Rift. It took me 2 6-day trips, one in May and one in December, to shoot this video, and hundreds of hours to write it and edit it. So please push the like button and subscribe to my channel that is dedicated to helping you explore the West.